12 most disturbing pleasures of medieval kings. A king who believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would grant him eternal youth. Another who chose to dine right beside the corpses of his freshly defeated foes. This is not fiction, this is medieval history. Yet, these kings had their names carved into the annals of time with the title the Great. These are just two of the 12 twisted pastimes that make historical records so haunting they border on the unbelievable. It wasn't about warfare. It wasn't about political machinations. It was about forms of entertainment so grotesque that, were they to happen today, they would horrify the entire world. The more terrifying truths? Most of these acts were considered completely normal at the time. What were these 12 games? And why does absolute power not make men greater, but morph them into something else entirely? Number 12. Forcing the blind and disabled to fight to the death for food. We often picture arenas filled with robust, hardened gladiators. But the ancient elite harbored a different kind of thirst. They reveled in carving deeper into the wounds of society's most vulnerable. Numerous 15th-century European chronicles recorded an amusement so heart-wrenching it sickens anyone who reads it today. Instead of able-bodied men, they would herd the blind or cognitively impaired into a fenced enclosure. The rules sounded deceptively simple. A prize, usually a live animal, was tossed into the yard. The sightless participants were handed heavy wooden clubs. Whoever struck the beast would claim the meal. But the reality was a meticulously calculated, cruel masquerade. Confined in a tight space, disoriented and unable to see, these men would begin swinging their weapons in sheer panic. They never hit the prize. Instead, they mercilessly battered their fellow sufferers. The blind terror, the agonized wails, and the tragic spectacle of frail humans unwittingly destroying each other became the most prized comedy. Up on the lavish balconies, the audience, the ruling class, noble ladies, and even children clapped and roared with laughter at the tragedy unfolding below. They casually weaponized the helplessness and trauma of their fellow humans into cheap entertainment. Turning pain into a pastime was already the zenith of depravity. Yet, these spectacles only sated their visual lust. When the thirst for power mingled with an obsession for eternal youth, cruelty took an entirely different, darker path. What happens when the life force of hundreds is drained day by day, merely to buy the tautness of a single individual's skin? Number 11. Bathing in virgin blood to preserve youth. In the 16th and 17th centuries, hundreds of young peasant girls were lured to palaces with the promise of lucrative work. But what awaited them was not a life of comfort, but subterranean chambers completely severed from the sun's light. The ruling elite harbored a sickening conviction. They believed the vitality and purity of youthful bodies was the ultimate elixir to tighten the skin and reverse the decay of aging. According to surviving records, intricate mechanical contraptions were forged solely to slowly, agonizingly wring the life out of these victims, drop by drop. All of it amassed to serve the morbid duty regimens of their master. When the supply of peasant girls ran dry, their greed extended its tentacles. They opened counterfeit finishing schools to deceive the daughters of lesser nobility. Hundreds passed through those castle gates, never to emerge again. Modern historians might still debate whether the detail of bathing in a tub full of blood was embellished. But trial transcripts from 1611 confirmed a chilling reality. The mass harvesting of human lives purely to serve a vanity obsession was unequivocally real. One individual's desperate craving to anchor time forced hundreds of other lives to freeze forever. The most venomous cruelty does not wear a face of wrath. It is perfectly masked beneath layers of snow-white powder in the serene, untouchable smile of a superior. That is the final rung of corruption. But the depravity of the elite did not stop there. If healthy bodies were entombed beneath the earth, those born with physical deformities faced a diametrically opposed tragedy. What happens when nature's anomalies aren't hidden away, but dragged beneath the brightest, most glamorous lights, forced to perform for a mocking laugh? Number 10. Keeping dwarves and Newtons for amusement. Put yourself in an era centuries past. Medicine and science were scarcely in their infancy. Any physical divergence quickly became a focal point for either fascination or extreme stigma. But for the ruling class, humans bearing physical anomalies were not cast out. Most were brought into the most resplendent castles. At a glance, it might have looked like salvation. But behind those heavy oak doors lay a much harsher reality. They were transformed into breathing toys. Numerous documents note that possessing people with unusual appearances was once the ultimate status symbol of wealth. Rulers would fiercely compete over who could collect the most bizarre individuals. These people were draped in ostentatious, expensive garments, yet the designs were intentionally ludicrous, crafted solely to exaggerate their deformities. In lavish banquets, their presence seemed mandatory. They were forced into acts that pushed past their physical limits, from dancing ceaselessly to performing degrading, self-deprecating plays. Sometimes, the upper crust went even further. They forced disabled individuals to marry each other, orchestrating pompous ceremonies that were, in truth, nothing more than a theater built to harvest to rice of laughter. There are even records of children born with malformations being snatched from their families. They were brought into the court to be raised alongside exotic birds and rare beasts. Their childhoods withered away between senseless walls, deprived of education or the dignity of being treated as a whole human being. They existed solely to satiate curiosity, caged within a suffocating extravagance. Empathy seemed a mythic concept at these dining tables. Stripping away autonomy and morphing another's sorrow into entertainment reflects a profound, echoing emptiness. They needed to witness the frailty of others to delude themselves of their own boundless supremacy. Yet, trampling on the dignity of the weak was merely the surface. When parading their power over the little people lost its thrill, they turned their daggers toward their own kind, sitting right there at the banquet. How would you react knowing that, right after those roars of laughter, noble guests had to endure a life-draining ordeal? A place where defying the host's command was unthinkable, even as their own bodies screamed for them to stop? Number 9. Banquets dragged out until guests collapsed. We often envision royal banquets as arenas of elegant diplomacy. A place where alliances are forged over crystal goblets of wine. However, under the reign of control-obsessed monarchs, the dining table morphed into an informal gladiatorial pit. A place where human endurance was tested to its absolute breaking point. When the one seated at the highest position raised his glass, an unwritten law was established. The feast would not end until the host was satisfied. Attendees were obligated to accept drinks relentlessly. A refusal could be construed as an act of treasonous defiance. Thus, they were forced to drain glass after glass in an endless, spinning carousel of excess. The human body inherently has physiological limits. When pushed beyond endurance, violent, natural rejections began. The veneer of elegance surrendered to a chaotic loss of control. Many guests vomited right at the table, staining priceless silk tablecloths. But the most haunting detail was the chilling nonchalance of the serving system. Servants would silently step forward, wiping away the mess in absolute muteness. Instantly, empty goblets were refilled to the brim. The music played on, the feast continued as if nothing had ever occurred. This coercion didn't stop at mere physical exhaustion. Documents record instances where guests collapsed completely from lethal overconsumption. They permanently closed the book on their lives amidst the clinking of glasses and the icy apathy of their peers. Forcing others to ingest what directly destroyed them seemed to grant the host an intoxicating illusion of absolute dominion. The agonizing irony lay in the fact that these noble guests were the victims themselves. They were forced to obliterate their own bodies for the amusement of a single man. But if you think collapsing at a feast was the worst of it, you haven't heard of a different kind of revelry. A place where the line between a lavish banquet and the abrupt end of a human life was completely erased. What happens when the music strikes up solely to score the exact moment a human destiny is severed, right in the broad light of day? Number 8. Dining beside the execution grounds. For certain rulers, the moment a death sentence was carried out wasn't merely an act in the name of justice. They warped these grim, deterrent events into festive, carnival-like gatherings. Human lives became nothing more than a garnish to spice up their personal indulgence. Picture a vast, sprawling square, suffocating under a thick, tense atmosphere. In the distance stands the high scaffold, where individuals face their permanent end. By all rights, this should be a moment for somber reflection, or at least a bare minimum of respect for human life. Yet, right on the periphery of that bleak, gray space, magnificent silk pavilions were erected. Royal tables groaned under the weight of smoking roast meats and exquisite vintage wines. As the decrees to sever life were executed, the king and his nobles began their feast. The smoke from the ashes still drifted through the air. Joyous music flared up, tangling with the surrounding gloom. Witnessing the erasure of an individual didn't seem to evoke a shred of pity. Instead, it acted as a grotesque catalyst, a flavor enhancer for the palates of those seated comfortably on their high platforms. What is even more thought-provoking is the mob mentality of that era. It wasn't just the elite, the common folk, too, were sucked into this vortex of apathy. People shoved and pushed to attend these execution judgments, swarming in as if going to a grand festival. They dragged along young children, whose minds were not yet formed. They all stood clustered around, watching the morbid process unfold like a cheap street play. The sanctity of the human lifetime gave way to a normalized habit of digesting the macabre. Casually dining and enjoying music on the margins of death exposed a deeply distorted perception of existence. Life, it seemed, was as trivial as a stage performance, beginning and ending with the mere nod of a superior. But is sitting passively as a spectator enough to satisfy a mind hungry for conquest? What if the ruler didn't want to just watch? They wanted to directly participate in the hunting game, where the prey were the very humans desperate to survive. Number 7. Hunting humans for sport. When galloping through deep forests no longer provided a potent enough thrill of conquest, the gaze of the powerful began to shift. Numerous historical texts whisper of an unimaginably cruel pastime enjoyed by certain lords. They turned their very own kind into targets in grossly mismatched pursuits. Those unlucky enough to fall into this nightmare were often disgraced individuals, or peasants yearning for freedom. They were hauled to the edge of a vast, dense, fog-choked forest. There, they received a promise. If they could escape the woods, they would be granted their freedom. But this was rarely a genuine chance at survival. It was, for the most part, a cruel mirage spun to prolong a psychological torture game. The very second these wretched souls mustered their last agonizing ounce of strength to flee, packs of hounds driven by feral instinct were unleashed. Their masters leisurely trotted behind on towering war horses. Clad in resplendent hunting attire, they followed at a relaxed pace, as if partaking in a Sunday picnic. The colossal imbalance of power meant the game had a predetermined end from the very beginning. Sometimes, the rulers of the realm themselves wished to personally dictate the final outcome. They would draw their bows, taking aim from afar to extinguish the last desperate thrashing of their prey. These acts served no purpose of enforcing societal rules. They were the pure, unadulterated enjoyment of commanding the life and death of another. Warping the blinding, thrashing panic of a struggling individual into a twisted psychological euphoria. A vast forest at least sowed a fragile, invisible thread of hope for an escape route. It fueled humans with the drive to keep running forward. However, the ultimate cruelty of a control-obsessed mind is to completely strip away every ounce of that hope. How do you think a person feels when forced to face a feral embodiment of death within a locked, inescapable room? Right under the gaze of dozens of eyes treating it as a theater act? Number 6. Releasing wild beasts into the palace for entertainment. Deep beneath the unyielding foundations of many ancient, glorious structures, there often existed highly specialized architectural zones. These weren't granaries, they were holding pens for creatures embodying untamed, feral power. Muscular lions, colossal bears, or specially bred packs of war dogs. Their presence rarely served the purpose of guarding the estate. They were frequently weaponized as tools to satiate the haunting visual lusts of the elite. According to various records, individuals who displeased their masters were often dragged down to these depths. They stood there, utterly alone and stripped of any defensive tools. Before them were beasts deliberately starved for days. This was no fair duel. It was the forced collision of a human being against the most primal, desperate survival instincts in a hopeless void. From high, securely isolated balconies, the nobility watched in drunken rapture. The roaring thunder of nature clashing with desperate, futile human resistance seemed to formulate a deeply intoxicating stimulant. These distinguished guests would even wager heavy coin on who could last the longest. Regardless of the outcome, the ultimate losers were always the lowly, the forgotten, those crushed beneath the glamorous facade of the caste system. The beasts acted out of gnawing hunger. But the elite forced their own kind into a dead end merely to cure their boredom. Cruelty isn't born naturally. It awakens when those in power have no laws left to bound them. How do you judge the corruption of humanity when handed absolute authority? Leave your perspective in the comments section below. And brace yourself. Because the 5 truths in the latter half of this list, this is where the final boundaries of morality are brutally exposed. Number 5. Watching torture as a theatrical performance. A subterranean chamber echoes with the agonizing creak of wooden gears. Right beside it, the rhythmic, elegant clinking of a silver goblet rings out. A ruler sits leisurely on a cushioned throne, savoring exquisite delicacies. Right before his eyes, machines designed to shatter the very limits of human physical endurance are operating at maximum capacity. It is an extreme visual dichotomy. On one side, opulent indulgence, on the other, unfathomable endurance. They didn't delegate this grim task to executioners. They wanted to sit there themselves, for hours on end. Unhurried. Unangered. They ordered the mechanics to continuously, minutely tweak the devices. Not to bring about a swift end, but to intentionally prolong the agony of the person before them. Listening to the desperate pleas for mercy became a spiritual elixir, nourishing their bloated sense of omnipotent power. Observing pain within a confined space laid bare a grotesque lust for control. But what happens when the ruler refuses to keep this privilege to himself? They want to drag thousands of others into a massive, open-air theater of cruelty. Number 4. Hosting survival arenas inside the palace. Picture a yard churning with thick, sloppy mud right in the heart of the palace. Prisoners, locked away for agonizing periods, are herded outside. No weapons, no armor. Their clothes are in rags. The heavy stench of physical decay mingles with the buzzing of flies under a suffocating heat. The rules of this game offer no glory. From the safety of intricately carved balconies, the nobility casually toss moldy crusts of bread and half-eaten scraps down into the muck. To get anything into their hollow stomachs, these emaciated souls are forced to completely shed their human dignity. They hurl themselves at each other, rolling in the thick, viscous sludge, blindly clawing to snatch every scattered crumb. Every bond of fellowship between prisoners is violently ripped apart by the gnawing agony of starvation. The true cruelty lies in the audio. Piercing through the sounds of the filthy, muddy scuffle below are the roaring, breathless laughs raining down from above. The soap-clad elite cover their mouths in amusement, pointing and placing wagers on who will grab the moldy bread first. They don't throw food down to show mercy. They throw it to witness, with their own eyes, how their fellow humans can strip away their humanity and act like feral beasts. Manipulating starvation to force the weak to butcher each other's dignity is a daytime amusement. But when night falls, and the heavy doors of the royal banquet slam shut, what happens then? Does the reasoning of the upper class maintain its sanity, or do they willingly drown themselves in a vortex just as naked and corrupted? Number 3. Nights of revelry crossing all moral boundaries. Extreme material overabundance always breeds a highly dangerous condition: profound boredom. When external amusements lose their bite, the elite turn inward, cannibalizing their own primal instincts. The Great Hall is suffocatingly thick with the smoke of exotic incense. Potent liquors spill carelessly over priceless Persian rugs. From the moment one crosses the threshold, every boundary of status or etiquette is entirely obliterated. The upper class strips off their dignified ceremonial garb. They hurl themselves into uncontrollable dances and twisted, debauched rituals. The scene is a chaotic, spinning delirium. There have been countless instances where these all-life frenzies ended in absolute terror. Many individuals were permanently drained, losing their cognitive grasp on reality. Some guests paid with their very lives, their bodies reacting violently to lethal overconsumption of drinks. Religious institutions harshly condemned these acts time and time again. But thick, impenetrable stone walls always know how to swallow the darkest of secrets. They played with the living, then gleefully strangled their own sanity. It seemed no barrier could hold them back. So, what do they do when the target they wish to aim at is already buried deep beneath the earth? Number 2. Exhuming enemy corpses for humiliation. In the worldview of absolute tyrants, death is not a release. The fact that an enemy can no longer feel fear is perceived as an unacceptable defeat. Midnight in a sprawling square. Torchlight illuminates the grim work of iron crowbars prying open the lid of a stone sarcophagus. The dust of ages rises into the bitter chill of the air. The deceased, perhaps a political rival or a predecessor to the throne, is once again violently dragged back from the embrace of the earth. The eternal silence is shattered. Exposing the decaying remnants of time isn't merely an act of desecration. It is a haunting, obsessive display of supreme power. Mobs of commoners are forced to gather. They must grit their teeth and bear witness to the impermanence of human existence being paraded as a grotesque joke. Power, at this juncture, doesn't just trample on the physical body, it completely obliterates the very concept of the most fundamental dignity of the life cycle. Manipulating the eternal rest of another betrays a deeply deformed psyche. Yet, the most iconic masterpiece of the ruling class lies elsewhere. It is the way they directly stepped into the director's chair to orchestrate the exact moment a life is severed. Number 1. Turning executions into theatrical performances. We finally hit the absolute rock bottom of moral decay. At the highest echelons of power, extinguishing the presence of a life is no longer about maintaining order. It is painstakingly staged as a classic theatrical performance. Every minuscule detail is meticulously arranged. A high scaffold, draped in brilliant red velvet, sits dead center. Surrounding it are rows of plush, velvet-lined seats, strictly organized by rank. A live orchestra strikes up epic, tragic symphonies to push the crowd's emotional frenzy to its absolute peak. The person kneeling on the high platform unwittingly becomes the lead actor in his script with no escape. Sometimes, the almighty director orders the executioners to drag out the procedures. The process of severing a life is agonizingly slowed down simply because the script isn't entertaining enough yet. When the fateful moment finally closes, the crowd below erupts in thunderous applause and cheers. In his isolated, elevated seat, the director leans back slightly, raising his glass of drink with a look of supreme smugness. All standards of human empathy are entirely eclipsed by the counterfeit, blinding halo of absolute domination. Every performance must eventually come to an end. Those distinguished guests of a bygone era have vanished into the mists of the past, leaving behind only massive, deathly silent halls. If you ever have the chance to step into the extravagant monuments of antiquity, try listening to the wind howling through the stone corridors. Perhaps you'll realize the greatest cruelty doesn't lie in the instruments of torture, but in how terrifyingly calm a human being can be while stripping away the dignity of their own kind. With the turbulent years you've witnessed in your own life, what is your perspective on the limits of power? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. The silent gaps of history always require a profound empathy to fill. Thank you for joining us in this video.